Additionally, she's going to start with just a quick couple opening remarks. And then just because we're together and you know, it's not a huge group, you can unmute, but just don't talk over each other. And we have about, you know, 30 minutes for Q&A, and we'll go from there if that works. If there's any questions before we begin technically speaking, I'm happy to take them. You can use the chat to message me. Yes, grant permission to record. Let me make sure I know how to do that. Give me a moment because I don't want to start.
I can tell you how to do that.
Tell me how to do it because I'm having a hard time finding it. Yes, thank you, Kristen.
Yeah, nice to meet you. So go to manage participants.
Perfect. That's not where I was.
And then navigate to the person who you will be granting recording privileges. Click more next to their name. Select option to record.
Perfect. Give me 2 seconds then.
So do it for everyone, right?
Yes.
No, only for me. Just kidding.
There we go. It's not actually letting me. It's really bizarre. I don't see that option. Now I'm embarrassed. I apologize, folks, because I've only been on the receiving end of recording other meetings before. I don't see that option. Hold on a second. And you're watching me use my eyes trying to.
So is there a more button next to our names?
It's not there either. I mean, there's a more button, but it says stop video, spotlight video, make host, make co-host, put in waiting room, remove.
Interesting.
Yeah.
If you make them co-host, does that allow them to record?
Let's see, because we're a small group and we're all friends.
Yeah.
Kristen, we're starting with you. I made you a co-host. Don't
Okay.
do anything crazy. Can you record?
I can.
Okay, I'm gonna make everybody a co-host and just we trust that we're gonna be civil and.
And I could make comments, and I'm not going to.
Yeah. That should be everybody. Does anybody not have access to record at this point? Just let me know. Okay, great. So, although, okay. Everybody's recording that needs to? Okay.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So with that, let me spotlight Lucy's video and turn it over to her to make a few comments, and then we'll let you go from there, ask some questions. So Lucy, take it away.
Okay, let me just start with sort of the basics of the sequence. We are in the middle of a earthquake swarm in the Imperial Valley. The largest earthquake was of magnitude 4.9 yesterday afternoon. There have been a total of 7 earthquakes, including the 4.9, that are above magnitude 4. And then there's another 54 events that have been between magnitude 3 and 4. So this is a very productive swarm. This type of behavior is characteristic of the Imperial Valley. It's in something called the Brawley seismic zone, which is a group of small faults, sort of a network of intersecting northwest and northeast striking faults that connect between the San Andreas Fault to the north and the Imperial Fault to the south. Those two faults are part of the boundary between the Pacific Ocean Plate and the North American Plate. And so the Brawley seismic zone really is part of that boundary, but it's got all these little tiny faults instead of one big one. So we've never seen an earthquake larger than 5.8 in the Brawley seismic zone. but we have many times seen swarms with hundreds or thousands of events. So we seem to be in the middle of one of those. Mostly, and this looks to be what's happening now, those swarms have a very active period that will last for a few hours to many hours. Usually within a day, it's starting to decay, looking more like a normal aftershock sequence with the number going down. And we do seem to be moving into that phase. I looked back through the history and I found one back in the 1970s where after this stage, it sort of revived again and had another group. Most of them by this phase continued to go down. So the U.S. Geological Survey has released earthquake probabilities. The work that I got set up while I was still there, but is now being taken on by the younger crew. And they have said, 90% chance. We've seen what there is to see, that, there might be some more fours, and that's it. 10% chance we could get up into something bigger, but that number is going down with time. And as I said already, I've only can see one event in the previous history that revived and really got going with even a bunch more fours would be a lot less likely at this point. That's what I can think of right off. Why don't I go with some questions and follow up with more details that you want?
Kristen, why don't you go first since you helped me figure this thing out?
Oh, I appreciate that. So I guess my first question is, so in Kern County, our devastation last year was the Ridgecrest earthquakes. Are there any, should we at all in Kern County be worried about these?
No, that one I can be clear about. So one earthquake does make another earthquake more likely nearby, and its ability to trigger another earthquake dies off quite rapidly with distance. So you can think about an earthquake sequence, whatever's the largest earthquake gives you an approximate idea of the size of fault involved, because the longer the fault, the bigger the earthquake. For Ridgecrest, that was 30 miles. For this earthquake, it's about 2 miles. Now, the ability to trigger, aftershocks are within 1 fault length. So if you have a 2-mile wide fault, anything within 2 miles of that we'll call an aftershock. For Ridgecrest, it was anything within 30 miles of that 30-mile long fault. So it was a much bigger area. Out to about 3 to 4 times the fault length, you can see some increased risk, usually just for the first couple of days. With Ridgecrest, that edged at the San Andreas. So you've got sort of different statements from different scientists. There's no risk at all, or there's a little bit of risk. That was because it was right at the edge of where we ever see it. With this one, the same distance is like 5 miles, 7 miles. So Imperial Valley is going to be feeling more earthquakes today. There is just no impact at all beyond something like 5 to 10 miles around that area.
Okay, perfect. And also we did have earthquakes in Ridgecrest again in June. So again, like there's no worries about these. Okay,
so aftershock sequences can go on for a long time. We use the word aftershock as long as the rate at which earthquakes are happening in that region is higher than it was before the main shock. It jumps up at the main shock, dies back down, and then you have this long tail where you're still above it. Ridgecrest is clearly still within its aftershock sequence. You're having 100 earthquakes a week along the fault. Mostly they're smaller. When you have a lot of small ones, you usually have a couple of bigger ones within it. So large late aftershocks are very, very common. You had the 5.5 in June, I think it was. Another 5 in Ridgecrest would be really, really normal. The last 5, if you remember the Landers earthquake, similar size, 7.3 in 1992. Maybe you weren't even born then. But the last aftershock to the 92 earthquake happened, the last magnitude 5 aftershock to 92 happened in 98. So 6 years after the main shock was the last magnitude 5 aftershock. Something like that. Ridgecrest might die off a little faster. It also has a higher background level in that area. There's a lot of magnitude 5s over the last 50 years there. This earthquake, it's smaller. My guess it will be back to background level within a month.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Why don't we go, Christian?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Christian Galeno with KYMA. We're actually based out of the Imperial Valley as well.
Okay.
And in Yuma, Arizona. So this is pretty big for us. Like, you know,
Right.
It's quite significant. You sort of did answer that one of the questions that I have, where if it's going to have any sort of effects on, say, the San Andreas Fault as well. But does the possibility exist of a stronger earthquake? You know, you did mention that it doesn't go any bigger than 5.8, but does that possibility ever exist of a stronger one in the Imperial Valley?
Okay, so the Imperial Valley has two big features. There's this Brawley seismic zone that runs from Bombay Beach in the Salton Sea down to the Imperial Fault. It intersects with the Imperial Fault. I think the town of Holt is not too far away. I'm forgetting exactly
Holtville?
the town. What?
Holtville?
Holtville. Yes, Holtville is near where the Imperial Fault connects to the seismic zone. The town of Brawley is actually just a little bit east of the intersection of the Brawley seismic zone with the Imperial Fault, to give you that framework. So the chance of a 5 plus at the same location where the swarm is going on is relatively high. I mean, there's a decent chance. It's probably less than 50-50 at this point, but there's a decent chance of it. Back in 1981, there was an earthquake we called the Westmoreland earthquake. Had the same sort of swarm. The largest one was 5.8. So that's the largest one we've ever seen in the Brawley seismic zone, was actually in this location. Now, the Imperial Fault had a 6.4 in 1979 and a 6.9 back in 1940. So it is a very active feature. This probably isn't, this is probably too far away from the Imperial Fault to be much of a risk. If there was going to be a bigger one, I think it would have to be on that fault. This location is too far from the Imperial Fault. It's about, let me see. I think we're looking at something like 20-30 kilometers, maybe 15 miles approximately from these earthquakes to the Imperial Fault. And we almost always see foreshocks just within a few kilometers. So the fact that it's that far away makes it much less likely. It's even farther from the San Andreas. It's more like 30 miles from the San Andreas. So, you know, none of us are looking at the San Andreas as a likely trigger point on this. The one thing I would say is, you know, geologists tend to think on longer timescales than most human beings. If we look at the history of the Imperial Valley, in the 1930s, there were earthquake swarms like this quite often, every year or two. In the 1970s, we also went into a period of really high activity. And now we're starting to see it again. We had one, there was a 5.7 in 2012. I think it was called Brawley. It was south of where these ones are. We've had several others with several 3s over this time. So it does look like we might be able to, it might be completely random. It might be episodic, that we have decades with more activity. And the simplest way of thinking of it is when you have a lot of earthquakes, you tend to have a lot of earthquakes. So if we're back in a time, you know, where we're having several swarms within a few years, you know, will we have more in the next few years? Probably. So I think that this type of earthquake should now be thought of as, you know, something that's going to show up every few years where you are there in Imperial, in the Brawley seismic zone. The chance of setting off one of those bigger ones is less, but is there. I wouldn't worry about it particularly today. These are just too far away. But in the long run, you're one of the most active places of California.
Now that kind of does bring me the it brings me to the thought of preparedness. I'm from Los Angeles, so growing up in LA, we grow up with, the earthquake drills and be prepared for the big one. What kind of advice would you have for residents in this area as far as preparation?
It's a great question. So here you're feeling earthquakes. It's a wonderful time to say, oh, right, this is part of it. And some of them are going to be bigger than this. There's a lot of things you can do to be better prepared. Wonderful resources online at earthquakecountry.info or earthquakecountrylliance.org. I think both of those names work. And, in a couple of weeks, we are going to be having the Great Shakeout. So the shakeout drill is a time to remind yourself what to do, actually practice, going under a table, because our instincts say we want to run outside. We need that muscle memory of getting under the table to remember that's the right thing to do. Any groups could do it together. We aren't in person much anymore because it's not that safe. But if you are working, if you do have employees coming in, get them to remember to do that. Shakeout.org has great information about how to do a drill. You can sign up and be part of a bigger thing. And I also really like to talk about shakeout as a time to do the drill, practice, drop, cover, hold on, and do one more thing. It's a time to think about earthquakes. There's a lot you can do. I mean, take the glass object on your shelf and use some quake wax and hook it down. Because I don't want to have it fall on me while I'm sitting at my desk. Right? So I think that if you can just think about those sort of things, store some water, whatever water you have, you probably need some more. This is a great reminder of that. And because most of the time we will have earthquakes like we're having right now that aren't too big, and much more rarely, but definitely at some point in the future, we're going to have much bigger ones that will do a lot more damage.
All right, thank you very much.
Sure, thanks.
Let's go to Danny next. If you have any questions, Danny.
Hi there. Welcome to my car. So I just had a quick question. That community, because we cover the Salton Sea area, and I know it was southwest of the Salton Sea.
Pretty much due south, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's just about due south of Bombay Beach, and it's a little bit west of Raleigh.
Okay. I guess my biggest question is for that community. I'm sure that they probably sense a panic. What would you say to them? I mean, 240 is kind of a lot. So.
Right. We had 64 earthquakes of 3 or greater, and if you're on top of a 3, you feel it. So you've been feeling a lot of motion. The best reassurance is to know that this is normal for the Imperial Valley. This is characteristic of how the earthquakes happen there. And the twice that they've had a really big earthquake in 1940 and 1979, those were not swarms. They didn't have this type of multiple. There was one big earthquake followed by aftershocks. And so it's maybe scary to have them repeatedly happening, but it does less damage to spread the energy out over 60 events than to have it just in one.
Got it. And I know just last week we had in Desert Hot Springs, we had 2 earthquakes back to back. I mean, they were small, I think, but I think the highest was 3.9. But they were right by the San Andreas Fault.
Right.
So anything, do you predict that a bigger one could hit near there, especially since we just had one?
Okay. Eddie, if you live by the San Andreas, you are living in the worst, you're going to have an earthquake at some point. The ability of one earthquake, of a small earthquake, to trigger a big one is concentrated in time and space. It has to be right next to the fault. So the Desert Hot Springs one were close enough to have a little impact on the San Andreas. Today's ones aren't. The Salton Sea, or the Imperial Valley earthquakes are too far away to have any impact on the San Andreas. The Desert Hot Springs ones were close enough, but it also drops off really rapidly with time. So the Desert Hot Springs earthquake probably raised the probability of a San Andreas a little bit for about a day. And the fact that it's already been a week, now the risk is already gone. I did some studies quite a while ago when I first came back to California looking for patterns in how small earthquakes precede the big ones. And it's concentrated in the first day. And by the time you get out beyond 5 days, it's a really, it's almost gone. If it's a really big earthquake like Joshua Tree, it was a magnitude 6.1 and 2 months later, the 7.3 Landers earthquake happened. So if you're talking about a 6, the whole ability stays around longer, just like I was talking about the aftershocks, right? The aftershocks for a 7 might go on for decades. The aftershocks to this 4.9 are going to go on for a month. So the smaller the earthquake is, the smaller the time that it really has any impact on anything.
So you don't predict a bigger one then?
Number one, we don't predict the time of an individual earthquake. It's impossible to do. I've seen various things going around social media. They are not based in any science. And you'd think, the same people have been putting out probability of an earthquake in the next 3 days is 98%. When you get that wrong a few times, you got to realize that you've disproved the model at a very significant level. So scientists are not making predictions of individual events. There is no scientifically based way of doing it. The degree to which one earthquake affects another is very constrained in both time and space.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Why don't we go to Brandon next? If you've got any questions. Anything, Brandon? You're on mute. Going once. Let's go to Patrick then. Patrick Evans. If you unmute yourself, you have any questions for Dr. Jones?
Actually, one thing, so I'm a meteorologist, and one of the things that we always hear, people always ask, oh, what's the correlation between, is it earthquake weather? And once again, and I know you've addressed this before, but I would just, I would love to have the soundbite of you saying there is no correlation that we know of between weather and earthquakes.
Two things to be said. Earthquakes are so far down in the earth, surface weather doesn't change what's happening where they are. Just go into a wine cellar and that the impact of the temperature of the air really doesn't change what happens in the earth. However, there's a tradition of earthquake weather in every culture with earthquakes because we want to have a pattern. You can read 2,000-year-old Roman pieces about how winds are setting off earthquakes. The key to see that this is just human myth instead of physical reality is every culture has a different tradition of what earthquake weather is. They've assigned it to whatever weather they had at their most significant earthquake. So actually 33 years ago today, we had the Whittier Narrows earthquake in Los Angeles during a heat wave. Guess what? Heat waves on October 1st are not rare in Los Angeles. And that began the tradition of hot weather as earthquake weather. To the earlier generations of Californians, my mother called foggy, still weather earthquake weather, because that's what they had for the 1933 Long Beach earthquake. Again, pretty common weather in March in Long Beach.